The captain's voice crackled through the intercom, and suddenly every face in first class turned toward me. The same passengers who had recoiled from my presence, who had whispered to flight attendants about security concerns, now stared with something between shock and shame. The woman in 3A, the one who'd demanded to be moved, was covering her mouth with both hands. Her husband's newspaper lay forgotten in his lap, his eyes wide as he processed what the pilot had just announced. I sat there, in my worn jacket, my calloused hands folded, watching 37 years of silence finally break open at 30,000 feet. Everything I'd kept buried was about to surface, and there was nowhere for any of us to run. My name is William Torres, and I'm 72 years old. What I'm about to tell you happened last month on a flight from Denver to Washington, D.C., but the real story, the one that matters, started decades before I ever stepped foot on that plane. The boarding announcement echoed through Terminal B, and I checked my ticket one more time. 3C, first class. My daughter Maria had insisted on upgrading my seat. "Papa, you've been flying coach your whole life. Just this once, let me spoil you." I'd protested, told her it was a waste of money, but she'd already booked it. "Consider it an early birthday present," she'd said, that stubborn smile that reminded me so much of her mother. I gathered my small carry-on, a canvas duffel bag I'd owned since the 80s, and joined the boarding line. The gate agent, a young man with perfectly styled hair, glanced at my ticket and then at me, his smile faltering slightly. I was wearing my best clothes, a navy blazer I'd bought at JCPenney 15 years ago, pressed khakis and shoes I'd polished that morning until they gleamed. But I knew what he saw, the frayed edges of my sleeves, the slight yellowing around my collar, the way my jacket hung loose on my frame. "First class, sir." His tone carried a question mark. "That's right?" I handed him my ID. He studied both documents longer than necessary, then waved me through with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. The jetway felt endless. My knee, the one that hadn't been quite right since the factory accident in '98, ached with each step. Behind me I heard the rustle of expensive luggage and the confident chatter of business travelers. Someone was discussing a merger. Someone else complained about their hotel's thread count. I stepped into the plane's first-class cabin, and the conversation stopped. It wasn't dramatic, not like in the movies, just a subtle shift, the way voices lower when something unexpected enters a room. The flight attendant, a polished woman in her 40s, approached with a bright smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr." She glanced at her tablet. "Torres, you're in 3C, middle seat." The middle seat. In first class, no less. I'd wondered about that when Maria booked it, but she'd said it was all that was available. I moved down the aisle, past 1A, where a silver-haired man in a $1,000 suit was already settled with his laptop open, past 2B, where a woman with perfectly manicured nails was scrolling through her phone. As I approached row 3, I saw my seatmates for the first time. To my left, in the aisle seat, sat a man about my age but carrying himself like someone half younger. His hair was professionally styled, his watch caught the cabin light, and his carry-on was leather that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. He looked up as I approached, taking in my appearance with the quick, efficient assessment of someone used to sizing up people's worth. In the window seat was his wife. I could tell by the matching wedding rings and the way she immediately looked to him for guidance. She was elegant in that effortless way that comes from money, her silk blouse probably worth more than my entire outfit. "Excuse me," I said quietly, indicating the middle seat between them. The man's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. "Oh." He glanced at his wife, who was now looking at me with barely concealed concern. "Are you certain you have the right seat?" I checked my boarding pass again, though I knew I was right. 3C. "It's just—" The woman leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "This is first class." Heat crept up my neck, but I kept my voice steady. "Yes, ma'am, I'm aware." The man cleared his throat. "Perhaps there's been some mistake with the booking system. These things happen." He was already reaching for the call button. "No mistake." I remained standing in the aisle, my duffel bag growing heavier in my hand. Other passengers were boarding behind me, and I could feel their eyes, their impatience. The flight attendant appeared beside me, all professional concern. "Is there a problem here?" "We were just wondering," the woman began, her voice carefully modulated, "if perhaps Mr. Torres might be more comfortable in coach, if there's been some sort of upgrade error." The flight attendant looked at me, then at my ticket, then back at the couple. I could see her calculating, trying to find the path of least resistance. "Mr. Torres, your ticket does show 3C. If you'd like, I could check if there are any available seats in—" "No." The word came out harder than I intended. "This is my seat." Behind me, someone muttered about the delay. The man in 3A was now openly staring, his laptop forgotten. I could feel the weight of the entire cabin's attention, the mixture of curiosity and discomfort that ripples through a crowd when social boundaries are being tested. The woman in the window seat whispered something to her husband. He nodded and pressed the call button again. "Listen," he said, not quite looking at me, "we'd be happy to pay for your upgrade to, well, to wherever you'd prefer to sit. It's not about money." But it was about money. It was about the assumption that someone like me, with my discount store clothes and my working man's hands, couldn't possibly belong in first class unless there'd been some cosmic error. It was about the certainty in their voices that I would gratefully accept their offer to return to where I belonged. "This is my seat," I repeated, and something in my tone made the man's mouth close. I moved past him, squeezing into the middle seat as he reluctantly shifted his legs. The woman immediately reached for her purse and pulled out a small bottle of hand sanitizer. The sound of her using it was loud in the sudden quiet. As I buckled my seatbelt, I noticed her pull out her phone and type rapidly. A moment later, I saw her husband's phone light up with a message. They were texting each other about me, sitting 3 feet away. The flight attendant lingered nearby, checking on other passengers but keeping us in her peripheral vision. I could almost hear her internal debate about whether to escalate this situation to the captain. More passengers filed past, and I caught fragments of conversations that stopped when they reached our row. The whispers started then, not malicious exactly, but the kind of speculation that happens when people encounter something that doesn't fit their expectations. I closed my eyes and tried to remember why I was on this plane. The letter in my inside jacket pocket seemed to burn against my chest. 47 years I'd kept that secret, and now, at 72, I was finally going to Washington to face it. The man beside me shifted, in his seat, creating as much distance as possible between us. His wife had moved so far toward the window that she was practically pressed against the glass. The engines started their low rumble, and I felt the plane push back from the gate. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back now. The flight attendant was walking toward the cockpit, her radio crackling with a message I couldn't quite hear, but something in her expression told me this flight was about to become very different from what anyone expected. The safety demonstration began, but I could feel the tension radiating from my seatmates like heat from an oven. The woman, I'd caught her name when her husband called her Margaret, kept glancing at me through her peripheral vision, as if I might suddenly produce something dangerous from my canvas bag. Her husband, whose boarding pass I'd glimpsed read Dr. Harrison, was pretending to read the airline magazine, but the pages hadn't turned in 5 minutes. The flight attendant, whose name tag read Jessica, stopped at our row during her safety check. "Everyone comfortable here?" Her question was directed at the couple, not me. "Actually," Margaret said, her voice taking on that particular tone wealthy women use when they're about to make demands, "I was wondering if there might be any other seating arrangements possible. I have claustrophobia. The middle configuration makes me quite anxious." I almost laughed. Claustrophobia. In first class, where the seats were twice the size of coach and spaced so far apart you could practically do yoga between them. Jessica's smile became strained. "I'm afraid we're completely full today, Mrs. Harrison. But I could bring you an extra pillow, perhaps some chamomile tea once we're airborne." Dr. Harrison looked up from his magazine. "What about moving Mr. He glanced at me. "Torres to an empty seat elsewhere. Surely there must be something available." "I'm sorry, sir, but Mr. Torres has paid for his seat, just like everyone else. I can't ask him to move unless he volunteers to do so." 3 pairs of eyes turned to me. The expectation hung in the air like smoke. This was my cue to be gracious, to recognize my place, to make everyone comfortable by removing myself from their space. "I'm fine where I am," I said quietly. Margaret's face flushed. "This is ridiculous. Henry, do something." Dr. Harrison, Henry, leaned forward, lowering his voice, but not enough that I couldn't hear every word. "Listen, Mr. Torres, I'm sure you're a decent fellow, but surely you can understand our position. We pay quite a bit extra for first class, and we expect a certain atmosphere, nothing personal, you understand." The words hit me like a slap, not because they were new. I'd heard variations of them my entire life, but because of how casually they were delivered, explaining to a child why they couldn't sit at the grown-ups' table. "What atmosphere would that be?" I asked. Henry blinked, apparently unused to having his assumptions questioned. "Well, I mean, professional, business-like." "I see." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the letter that had brought me on this journey. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive paper with an official government seal. I didn't open it, just held it in my weathered hands. "And what makes you think I'm not professional?" Margaret was staring at the letter now, her curiosity warring with her prejudice. "What is that?" Before I could answer, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking. We've been cleared for takeoff and we'll be airborne in just a few minutes. Flight time to Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport is approximately 2 hours and 35 minutes. The plane began to taxi, and I slipped the letter back into my pocket. Henry was still waiting for an answer to Margaret's question, but I turned toward the window instead, watching the Denver skyline slide past. I thought about Maria's face when I'd told her about the letter. She'd been so proud, so excited. "Papa, this is incredible. Do you know what this means?" But she didn't know the whole story. None of my children did. How could I explain that this honor, this recognition that was 47 years overdue, came with a weight that could crush what was left of my life? The plane lifted off, and my stomach dropped with the familiar sensation of leaving the ground. Margaret's grip on her armrest was white-knuckled, though whether from flying anxiety or proximity to me I couldn't tell. Once we reached cruising altitude, Jessica appeared with the beverage cart. "What can I get you folks to drink?" "Scotch," Henry said immediately. "Make it a double." "White wine for me," Margaret added. "Something crisp." They both looked at me expectantly, probably assuming I'd order beer. Or maybe they hoped I wouldn't order anything at all. "Coffee, please. Black." Jessica poured from a carafe that looked like it cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The coffee was good, better than the instant I made at home, and I cradled the warm cup in my hands. "So," Henry said, apparently deciding to try a different approach, "what takes you to Washington? Business?" I considered how to answer. The truth was too complicated, too loaded with history these people couldn't possibly understand. Government business. "Oh?" Margaret perked up. "What kind of government business?" "The important kind." Henry's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being dismissed, wasn't used to having his polite interrogations deflected. In his world, people like me were supposed to be grateful for any attention from people like him. Even hostile attention. He said, his voice taking on an edge. "I've been flying first class for 30 years, and I've never encountered such rudeness." "Henry," Margaret warned, glancing around to see if other passengers were listening. But Henry was warming to his theme now, his double scotch already working on his inhibitions. "No, Margaret, I think it needs to be said. There are certain standards of behavior that come with certain privileges. When someone can't meet those standards—" "What standards?" I interrupted, setting down my coffee cup with more force than necessary. "The standard of being grateful for scraps, of knowing my place, of smiling and shuffling when someone decides I don't belong somewhere." The conversation in the rows around us had stopped. Other passengers were openly staring now, some looking embarrassed, others nodding along with Henry's implications. "That's not what I—" Henry began. "That's exactly what you meant." I turned to face him fully. "You looked at my clothes, at my hands, at my face, and you decided I was a mistake, an error in the system, something to be corrected." Margaret was frantically pressing the call button now. "Where is that attendant?" "Here's what you don't understand," I continued. my voice steady but carrying to the surrounding rows. "I've spent my entire life earning my place. I've worked jobs that would break your soft hands in a week. I've paid taxes on every dollar I ever made. I've served my country in ways you can't imagine." Henry leaned back, suddenly looking uncertain. "Served? You mean military?" Before I could answer, Jessica hurried over, her professional smile stretched thin. "Is everything all right here?" "Everything's fine," I said, though the air between the three of us crackled with tension. Margaret grabbed Jessica's arm. "I want to speak to the captain. This man is being threatening." "Threatening?" Jessica looked at me with new concern. "Sir, I need to ask—" "I haven't threatened anyone," I said calmly. "I've just been having a conversation about assumptions and respect." But I could see the doubt in Jessica's eyes now. The seed was planted. In her mind, I was transforming from an awkward passenger to a potential security risk. She excused herself and walked quickly toward the front of the plane. Henry was staring at me with something approaching fear now. "Listen, if you're some kind of... if you have issues with authority, maybe you should..." "Issues with authority?" I almost smiled. "No, Dr. Harrison. My issues are with people who think their money makes them better than everyone else. People who've never had to prove they deserve to breathe the same air as their betters." Margaret was trembling now. "Henry, maybe we should..." She never finished the sentence, because at that moment Jessica returned with the co-pilot, a young man with serious eyes and captain's stripes on his sleeves. He stopped at our row and looked directly at me. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with me." The co-pilot's request hung in the air like a blade. Around me I could feel the entire first-class cabin holding its breath. Margaret clutched Henry's arm, her face a mixture of vindication and fear. Henry himself had gone pale, suddenly realizing that his complaints might have escalated beyond his comfort zone. "Of course," I said, unbuckling my seatbelt. My voice was steady, but my hands betrayed me with the slightest tremor as I stood. The co-pilot, his name tag read First Officer Martinez, gestured toward the front of the plane. "This way, sir." I followed him up the aisle, past rows of passengers who had abandoned all pretense of minding their own business. A woman in 2A was recording with her phone until Martinez gave her a sharp look that made her lower it quickly. The man in 1B, who'd been working on his laptop throughout the boarding process, now watched me with the keen interest of someone witnessing a potential news story. Martinez led me to the galley area near the cockpit, where Jessica waited with another flight attendant I hadn't seen before. An older woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen enough airline drama to fill a book. "Mr. Torres," Martinez began, his voice professional but not unkind. "We've received reports that you've made some passengers uncomfortable. Now I want to hear your side of this." The steel-gray flight attendant, her name tag read Susan, Senior Flight Attendant, crossed her arms. More than uncomfortable, according to Mrs. Harrison. She used the word threatening. Threatening. I repeated the word like I was tasting something bitter. "What exactly did I threaten?" Martinez pulled out a small notebook. "Let's start from the beginning. Mrs. Harrison says you refused to move when they offered to pay for an upgrade to a different seat. She says you became hostile when they tried to resolve the situation amicably." Hostile. Another bitter taste. "I said this was my seat. I said I had paid for it. That's hostile." Susan's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. "Mr. Torres, in today's climate, we have to take any reports of passenger aggression seriously. I'm sure you understand." I did understand. I understood that I was 72 years old, barely 150 pounds soaking wet, and somehow these people saw me as a threat to a cabin full of successful business travelers. I understood that my worn clothes and calloused hands had transformed me in their minds from a fellow passenger into something dangerous. "May I ask what brings you to Washington?" Martinez said, his tone shifting slightly. "Mrs. Harrison mentioned you spoke about government business." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the letter again. This time I handed it to Martinez without opening it. "This is what brings me to Washington." Martinez looked at the envelope, noting the official seal, the quality of the paper. His eyebrows rose slightly as he read the return address, Department of Defense, Office of the Secretary. He looked up at me. "May I?" I nodded. He opened the envelope carefully and unfolded the letter inside. As his eyes moved across the page, his expression changed completely. Susan noticed and moved closer, to read over his shoulder. I watched her face go from skeptical to shocked to something approaching awe. "Jesus," Martinez whispered, then caught himself. "I mean, Mr. Torres, do you mind if I ask, is this authentic?" "It's authentic." Susan was staring at me now with completely different eyes. "Sir, we had no idea. If we'd known what?" I asked quietly. "That I might actually belong in first class. That I might have earned the right to sit wherever I damn well please." Martinez was reading the letter again, more carefully this time. "Mr. Torres, this is extraordinary. The Congressional Medal of Honor. After all 47 years, I said. 47 years of them telling me the paperwork was lost, the witnesses were unavailable, the details were classified. 47 years of being told to be patient, that these things take time. The medal, the highest honor this country could bestow on a soldier, and they wanted to give it to me now when I was more than halfway to the grave, when most of the men who'd served with me were already dead. When the war that had taken so much from so many was just a footnote in history books." Susan's radio crackled to life. The captain's voice, low and urgent. "Susan, I need you up here and bring Martinez." "Captain," Susan responded, "we're dealing with the passenger situation from 3C. Bring him too, now." Martinez folded the letter carefully and handed it back to me. "Mr. Torres, the captain would like to speak with you." We walked the few steps to the cockpit door. Martinez knocked twice, and I heard the electronic lock disengage. The door opened to reveal the flight deck, banks of instruments glowing in the dim light, and Captain Rodriguez, a man about my age with graying temples and kind eyes. "Mr. Torres," he said, extending his hand, "it's an honor to meet you." I shook his hand, confused by the sudden change in atmosphere. "Captain, I just received a very interesting radio call from Washington," Rodriguez continued. "It seems the Pentagon has been trying to reach you. When you didn't answer your home phone, they called the airline. They wanted to make sure you were on this flight." My phone. I'd turned it off before boarding, the way Maria had taught me. "I don't understand." Rodriguez gestured to his co-pilot, a young woman who'd been monitoring our conversation with obvious curiosity. "Lieutenant Sarah Martinez. Yes, same last name, but no relation to our first officer here. She's former Air Force. When she heard why you were flying to Washington..." He paused. "Well, let's just say she had some thoughts about how you've been treated on this flight." The co-pilot, Lieutenant Martinez, turned in her seat. "Mr. Torres, I've read about Operation Red Dawn. What you did in Vietnam, what you and your squad accomplished. It saved hundreds of lives." Operation Red Dawn. I hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in decades. It was classified information, buried so deep that even my own family didn't know the details. But somehow these people knew. "How do you..." "The Pentagon declassified the files yesterday," Rodriguez explained. "They wanted to make sure the media had the full story before tomorrow's ceremony. Mr. Torres, you're not just getting the Medal of Honor. You're getting it for one of the most significant rescue operations in the Vietnam War." The cockpit suddenly felt too small, too warm. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, feel sweat gathering under my collar. For 47 years I'd carried the weight of that mission alone. The things we'd done, the men we'd lost, the impossible choice I'd made in a tunnel system under fire with 37 American prisoners, depending on me making the right call. "I need to sit down," I managed. Rodriguez was already pulling out a jump seat. "Of course. Susan, get him some water." As I sat there in the captain's chair, drinking water from a plastic cup while the plane flew toward my reckoning with history, I could only think about the faces in first class, the assumptions they'd made, the way they'd looked at me like I was some kind of mistake. Rodriguez cleared his throat. "Mr. Torres, I have a question for you, and I want you to know that whatever you decide, we'll support completely." I looked up at him. "Would you like me to make an announcement to the cabin about who you are, what you've done? Because frankly, after what happened back there, I think this plane could use a lesson in respect." Through the open cockpit door, I could see down the aisle to first class. Margaret and Henry were craned around in their seats, trying to see what was happening. Other passengers were doing the same. They were all waiting, all wondering what kind of trouble the old man in the cheap suit had caused. Tomorrow, the whole world would know my story. Tonight, I could let these people keep their assumptions, let them live in their bubble of superiority for a few more hours. Or I could let them learn what kind of man they'd tried to throw off this plane. "Make the announcement," I said. Captain Rodriguez nodded and reached for the intercom switch. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I have a very special announcement to make." I could feel my chest tightening as his finger hovered over the button. 47 years of silence, about to end with the flip of a switch at 30,000 feet. "Before I continue," Rodriguez said, "I want to ask all passengers to please take your seats and give me your full attention. What I'm about to share with you is a story of extraordinary courage and sacrifice." Through the cockpit door, I watched the cabin activity cease. Passengers who'd been moving around sat down. Flight attendants paused in their service. Even the sound of conversation died away. Rodriguez looked at me one more time, a question in his eyes. I gave him a small nod. "Folks, we have the honor today of flying with a true American hero. Mr. William Torres, seated in 3C, has been traveling to Washington, D.C. to receive our nation's highest military decoration, the Congressional Medal of Honor." The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the engines humming, the air circulation system cycling. I imagined Margaret and Henry in their seats, processing what they'd just heard. "The medal," Rodriguez continued, "is being awarded for Mr. Torres's actions during Operation Red Dawn in Vietnam, 1972. What many of you don't know is that this operation was classified for nearly 5 decades. The details were only declassified yesterday by the Pentagon." I closed my eyes, and suddenly I was back there. The jungle heat, the smell of cordite and fear sweat. The sound of Rodriguez's voice faded, replaced by the memory of Lieutenant Johnson's voice crackling through the radio. "Torres, you've got 37 POWs down there and a company of NVA moving on your position. Whatever you're going to do, you better do it. Fast." On March 15, 1972, Rodriguez was saying, then Sergeant Torres led a squad of 8 men into a heavily fortified tunnel complex near the Cambodian border. Intelligence indicated that 37 American prisoners of war were being held there, scheduled for transport north where they would likely never be seen again. I could feel Lieutenant Martinez watching me, her young face serious with understanding. She was Air Force, she'd said. She knew what it meant to make impossible choices under fire. "The mission was supposed to be a quick extraction," Rodriguez continued. "Get in, get the prisoners, get out." But when Sergeant Torres and his men reached the compound, they discovered that the intelligence was wrong. The tunnel system wasn't lightly defended. It was a major enemy stronghold with over 200 North Vietnamese soldiers. 213, actually. I'd counted the bodies afterward, when we were pulling our people out. But who was counting anymore? Sergeant Torres had a choice. He could abort the mission, follow orders, and return to base. Or he could attempt an impossible rescue against overwhelming odds. Through the intercom, I could hear the absolute silence in the cabin. No rustling, no coughing, no whispered conversations, just the captain's voice carrying the weight of history. Sergeant Torres chose to go in. I opened my eyes and found Susan staring at me with something approaching reverence. Behind her, I could see passengers in the front rows turning in their seats, trying to get a look at me through the cockpit door. What followed was an 18-hour battle in a maze of underground tunnels. Sergeant Torres and his squad, outnumbered nearly 30 to 1, fought their way through 3 levels of fortified positions. They freed all 37 prisoners. They held off counterattacks while evacuating wounded men through jungle terrain under heavy fire. Rodriguez paused, and I knew he was reaching the part of the story that still woke me up some nights, sweating and gasping. Of the 8 men who went into those tunnels with Sergeant Torres, only 3 came out alive, but all 37 prisoners made it home to their families. The weight of those names hit me like it always did. Martinez, the radio operator who died covering our first extraction point. Williams, barely 19, who'd taken shrapnel to the chest, but kept fighting until we got the last prisoner out. Henderson, Thompson, Collins, kids, all of them, who'd followed me into hell because I'd asked them to. The operation was classified because it took place in Cambodia, where American forces were not officially operating. For 47 years, Sergeant Torres, now Mr. Torres, has been unable to speak about what he did that day, unable to receive the recognition he earned, unable to tell his own family why he sometimes woke up screaming in the night. I felt tears on my cheeks and realized I was crying. But from something deeper. Relief, maybe. Or the strange lightness that comes when you finally set down a weight you've been carrying for half a century. Tomorrow, Rodriguez said, President Harrison will present Mr. Torres with the Medal of Honor in a ceremony at the White House. But today he's sitting in seat 3C, just trying to get to Washington like any other passenger. The intercom clicked off, and the silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then from somewhere in the cabin, I heard a single person clapping, then another, then more until the sound built into sustained applause that echoed through the fuselage. Susan was crying now too. Lieutenant Martinez had turned in her seat to face me, her hand over her heart in an informal salute. Even Rodriguez was wiping his eyes. "Mr. Torres," Susan said, her voice thick with emotion, "I owe you an apology." "You don't owe me anything." "Yes, I do. We all do." She gestured toward the cabin. "What happened back there, the way you were treated, it's inexcusable." I stood up slowly, my knee protesting. "I'd like to go back to my seat now." "Sir," Lieutenant Martinez said, "the captain has authorized me to offer you the jump seat up here for the remainder of the flight. You'd be more comfortable and—" "No," I shook my head. "My seat is 3C. That's where I belong." Rodriguez smiled at that. "I understand. Susan, would you escort Mr. Torres back and maybe announce that the beverage service is on the house for our honored guest?" As I walked back down the aisle, the entire cabin was watching me, but this time the stares felt different. The man in 1B stood up as I passed, extending his hand. "It's an honor, sir. Thank you for your service." Others followed suit. The woman in 2A who'd been recording earlier was crying openly. A businessman across the aisle saluted crisply, obviously military himself, and then I reached row 3. Margaret was pressed against the window, as far from the aisle as she could get. But she wasn't trying to avoid me anymore. She was staring at me with a mixture of shame and awe that made her look years older than she had an hour ago. Henry was standing in the aisle, blocking my path, but not with hostility this time. "Mr. Torres," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I don't know how to apologize." "Then don't," I said simply. "But you said what you believed to be true based on what you saw." I looked at both of them. "The question is, what do you believe now?" Margaret finally spoke, her voice cracking. "I believe we're terrible people." "No," I said, settling back into my middle seat between them. "You're just people who forgot that you can't tell a man's worth by looking at his clothes." Henry sat down heavily in his aisle seat. He was still holding his drink, but his hands were shaking so badly that the ice cubes rattled against the glass. "My father served in Korea," he said suddenly. "He used to tell me stories about men like you, men who did impossible things because it was right, not because it was easy." He looked at me directly for the first time since I'd sat down. I dishonored his memory today. Before I could respond, Jessica appeared at our row with a bottle of champagne I was pretty sure hadn't come from the regular service cart. "Compliments of the captain," she said, her professional smile replaced by something genuine and warm. "He wanted you to know that this flight, this crew, is honored to have you aboard." As she poured the champagne into real glass flutes, not the plastic cups they'd been serving everyone else, I felt something shift in the cabin around me. It wasn't just the way people were looking at me now. It was something deeper, a recognition that stories matter, that the man sitting next to you might be carrying history you can't imagine. Margaret accepted her champagne with trembling hands. "Mr. Torres, may I ask, do your children know about what you did?" "They know I served. They don't know the detail." "Why not?" I took a sip of the champagne. It was good, better than anything I'd ever tasted. "Because some stories are too heavy for children to carry, even grown children." Henry was studying me with new eyes. "But tomorrow the whole world will know." "Tomorrow," I agreed, "but not tonight." The plane banked slightly, beginning its descent toward Washington. Through the window, I could see the lights of the city spread out below us like a circuit board. Somewhere down there, in a building I'd only seen in pictures, they were preparing for a ceremony that was 47 years overdue. But as I sat there between Margaret and Henry, sharing champagne and watching their faces as they processed what they'd learned, I realized something else was happening. Something the Pentagon planners and ceremony coordinators couldn't have anticipated. The real moment of reckoning wasn't going to happen tomorrow at the White House. It was happening right now at 30,000 feet, in the space between who people thought I was and who I actually am. And as we descended toward the nation's capital, I found myself wondering which version of this story would matter more in the end. The descent into Washington began with the captain's voice crackling through the intercom one more time. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport. I want to thank you all for being part of something special today. It's not often we get to share a flight with a genuine American hero." I watched the city lights grow larger through the window, feeling the familiar pressure in my ears as we dropped altitude. Margaret hadn't spoken much since learning who I was, but I noticed she'd stopped pressing herself against the window. Henry had ordered another scotch, his third, and was holding it like a talisman. "Mr. Torres," Margaret said suddenly, breaking the silence that had settled over our row. "May I ask you something personal?" I nodded. When you were down there, in those tunnels, weren't you terrified?" The question caught me off guard. In 47 years, no one had ever asked me about the fear. They asked about the tactics, the strategy, the technical details of the operation, but never about the human cost of walking into that darkness. "Every second," I said honestly. "Fear kept me alive. Fear made me careful. Fear made me fast. But you went anyway. I went because 37 men were counting on me to bring them home. When someone's counting on you like that, your own fear becomes less important." Henry leaned forward. "The men you lost, do you ever think about what they would have wanted? Whether they would have thought it was worth it?" I was quiet for a long moment, watching the Pentagon slide by below us, its corridors probably buzzing with preparations for tomorrow's ceremony. Martinez, he was our radio operator. He had a letter in his pocket from his wife. She was pregnant with their first child. Right before we went into the last tunnel, he handed it to me and said, "If I don't make it out, make sure this gets home." The cabin around us had grown quiet again. Other passengers were leaning in, straining to hear. I carried that letter for 6 months before I worked up the courage to deliver it personally. His daughter was walking by then, taking her first steps, when I handed her mother that letter. I paused, remembering the weight of that moment. She said something I'll never forget. She said, "He would have wanted those men to come home, all of them." Margaret was crying openly now. "Did you stay in touch with the families?" "Some of them. Martinez's daughter, she's a doctor now, has 3 kids of her own. She still sends me Christmas cards." The plane touched down with a gentle bump, and I felt something in my chest loosen. We were here. After 47 years, I was finally in Washington, finally about to face the recognition I'd never thought would come. As we taxied toward the gate, Jessica's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated for a few extra moments. We have some special guests waiting to welcome one of our passengers." Through the window I could see them on the tarmac, men in dress uniforms, their medals catching the airport lights. A small delegation from the Pentagon probably, sent to ensure I made it to tomorrow's ceremony. Behind them I spotted something that made my throat tighten. News vans, their satellite dishes extended, cameras already rolling. "Looks like you're famous," Henry said, following my gaze. "Looks like it." The plane came to a stop, and the seatbelt sign dinged off. But instead of the usual rush to disembark, something extraordinary happened. The passengers in first class remained seated, all of them looking toward me expectantly. The man in 1B stood up. "First, Mr. Torres, would you allow us the honor of letting you deplane first?" I started to protest. I wasn't special. I was just a passenger like everyone else, but Margaret touched my arm gently. "Please," she said, "let us do this one thing right." I stood slowly, gathering my canvas duffel bag. As I stepped into the aisle, every passenger in first class rose to their feet. Then I heard it happening behind me, the sound of people standing throughout the entire plane, seat by seat, row by row, till the whole cabin was on their feet. Jessica was waiting at the exit door, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Mr. Torres, it's been the greatest honor of my career to serve you today." "Thank you, Jessica, for everything." As I stepped off the plane, the first person I saw was a young officer in dress blues, a lieutenant colonel, his chest heavy with ribbons. He snapped to attention and saluted. "Mr. Torres, I'm Lieutenant Colonel James Patterson, aide-de-camp to the Secretary of Defense. On behalf of the Secretary and the Joint Chiefs, welcome to Washington." I returned the salute, muscle memory from 5 decades ago taking over. Behind Patterson, I could see the delegation forming up. Senior officers, Pentagon officials, and yes, the media contingent that would turn my private moment into public spectacle. But before any of that could happen, I heard my name called from behind me. "Mr. Torres, wait." I turned to see Henry and Margaret hurrying down the jetway. Henry, still carrying his drink. They reached me just as the official delegation was approaching. "We wanted to—" Henry began, then stopped, looking overwhelmed. "We wanted to say thank you," Margaret finished simply, "for your service, for your sacrifice, and for showing us who we really are." Henry extended his hand, and when I took it, he didn't let go. "My father would have been proud to know you. I hope I can become someone he would have been proud of too." Before I could respond, the media moved in. Cameras flashed, microphones thrust forward. Reporters called out questions, but I barely heard them. I was looking at the faces around me, Jessica and the flight crew watching from the jetway, passengers pressed against the terminal windows, the young officers who'd come to escort me. All my life I'd felt like I was carrying the weight of that jungle, those tunnels, those choices alone. But standing there on the tarmac, surrounded by people who finally knew my story, I realized something profound. The weight was still there, it would always be there. But somehow sharing it had made it bearable. Lieutenant Colonel Patterson stepped forward. "Sir, if you're ready, we have a car waiting to take you to your hotel. Tomorrow will be a long day." I nodded, but before I could move, one more voice called out from the jetway. "Dad!" I spun around and saw her, Maria, my daughter, running toward me with tears streaming down her face. Behind her, my son Carlos, my daughter-in-law, my grandchildren, all of them somehow here, somehow part of this moment I'd never imagined. "How did you—" I began, as Maria threw her arms around me. "The Pentagon called us," she said through her tears. "They flew us out here. They said America's heroes shouldn't receive their medals alone." As my family surrounded me, as the cameras captured this moment I'd never thought I'd live to see, I looked back one more time at the plane. Through the terminal windows, I could see some of the passengers still watching. Margaret raised her hand in a small wave. Henry stood beside her, his face solemn and somehow transformed. They would go home tonight, and they would tell this story. They would tell their friends about the old man in the cheap suit who they'd tried to have removed from first class, who turned out to be a Medal of Honor recipient. Some would embellish it, make themselves more sympathetic in the telling. Others would be honest about their assumptions, their prejudices, their shame. But all of them would remember. And just maybe, the next time they saw someone who didn't fit their expectations, they would pause, they would wonder. They would ask themselves, what story might this person be carrying that I know nothing about? Tomorrow I would stand in the White House and receive a medal 47 years overdue. Presidents and generals would shake my hand, photographers would capture the moment for history, and the nation would officially recognize what happened in those tunnels in 1972. But tonight, as I walked across the tarmac with my family beside me, I knew the most important recognition had already happened. It had happened at 30,000 feet, in the space between strangers who became something more than strangers. It had happened when people chose to see beyond their assumptions, to listen beyond their prejudices, to honor the stories we all carry. The Washington Monument rose into the night sky ahead of us, lit against the darkness like a promise. Tomorrow would bring ceremony and speeches and official recognition. But tonight, I was just a father walking with his children, a man whose story had finally been heard, a veteran who was no longer carrying his service alone. And somehow, that was enough.